The clinking of silverware and the low hum of conversations had finally died down. The grand restaurant inside the Crystal Heights Hotel was nearly empty, with only a few guests lingering over their drinks. The air smelled faintly of roasted meat, fresh bread, and expensive wine, but for Amara Johnson, the scent no longer stirred her appetite. It only reminded her of how many hours she had stood on her feet, carrying trays heavier than her arms should ever have to bear. Amara adjusted her apron, tucking a stray braid back behind her ear, and moved silently from one table to the next. She carried a damp cloth in her hand, methodically wiping down the polished mahogany surfaces until they gleamed. The chandeliers above still sparkled, casting golden light across the room, but her eyes were heavy with exhaustion. It had been another 14-hour shift, back-to-back service from the breakfast rush, through the business lunch, and finally the long dinner crowd that stretched past midnight. Her manager often told her, "You've got the patience of a saint, Amara." But patience didn't pay overdue bills. It didn't cover school uniforms for her younger brother, Jordan, or the rent for their cramped two-bedroom apartment. She worked here because she had no choice. Life had thrown her challenges early. Her mother, once a housekeeper in the same hotel, had passed away 3 years ago, leaving Amara to shoulder responsibilities far too heavy for someone in their early 20s. Her father was long gone. She hadn't seen him since she was 12. So now, at 25, Amara was both sister and parent, working herself to the bone for a future that always seemed just out of reach. The hotel guests rarely saw her humanity. To them, she was just the waitress, a quiet, polite girl who served their food and bowed her head when they snapped their fingers. But behind her calm smile, Amara carried dreams bigger than the walls of the Crystal Heights. She wanted stability. She wanted respect. Most of all, she wanted a life where survival wasn't a daily battle. Her co-workers often complained loudly after shifts, cursing stingy tippers or arrogant guests. But Amara, though she sometimes joined in their frustrations, had learned to stay calm. She believed that bitterness only made long hours harder. Instead, she reminded herself why she was here: to keep her brother in school, to pay the bills, and to save whatever pennies she could for a better tomorrow. Tonight, however, exhaustion pressed on her more than usual. Her feet throbbed in her worn black shoes, and the muscles in her back felt like they might snap. Still, she moved carefully, cleaning each table as though it mattered. It wasn't just about following rules. Amara took pride in doing her job well. She believed that how you worked, even in the smallest tasks, reflected who you were. When she reached the last corner of the dining hall, she paused for a moment, resting her weight against the edge of a chair. Her reflection in the glossy tabletop stared back at her. A young woman with dark brown skin, sharp eyes that carried both strength and tiredness, and lips pressed into a line of determination. She sometimes wondered if anyone else noticed the fire in her eyes, or if the world only saw a uniform and a tray. "Amara," her co-worker Lucia whispered as she passed by, carrying a stack of plates toward the kitchen. "Girl, you look like you're about to drop." Amara smiled faintly. "I'll survive. One more hour, maybe less." "That's what you always say." Lucia shook her head with a chuckle. "If I were you, I'd have quit months ago." But quitting wasn't an option for Amara. She couldn't afford it. As the last guests signed their checks and the waitstaff began clearing dishes, Amara's mind wandered. She imagined what it might feel like to sit at one of these tables as a guest, dressed in something elegant, ordering whatever she wanted without checking her wallet first. She pictured herself not as a server but as someone who belonged. The thought was fleeting but powerful. Sometimes, when the weight of reality felt unbearable, she allowed herself these small daydreams. They were fragile sparks of hope, quickly hidden away, but they reminded her that she wanted more from life than endless shifts and aching bones. Her shift should have ended an hour ago, but the restaurant manager had asked her to stay until the dining hall was spotless. So she worked quietly, humming under her breath, her voice soft but soothing, a melody her mother used to sing. The grand clock near the bar ticked toward midnight. The hotel lobby was still alive with noise, the footsteps of wealthy guests, the laughter of businessmen returning from late meetings, the chatter of tourists excited about tomorrow's adventures. Amara had grown used to moving like a shadow through this world of wealth, invisible yet indispensable. She stacked the last set of clean glasses on the counter, straightened the silverware, and checked once more to be sure everything was perfect. It was in moments like this, when the room was quiet and the lights cast their warm glow, that Amara sometimes felt a bittersweet pride. She wasn't where she wanted to be, but she was doing what she had to do. What Amara didn't know was that this very night, her life was about to change. The long shift, the exhaustion, the endless cycle of invisibility. All of it was leading toward a moment she couldn't yet imagine. For tonight, she was just a waitress cleaning tables. But within the hour, she would cross paths with a man whose presence would alter her destiny forever. The restaurant was almost silent now, save for the faint clinking of dishes in the back kitchen. Amara thought the night was finally drawing to an end. She had just placed the cleaning cloth back in her apron pocket when the grand double doors of the dining hall swung open with a sudden burst. The man who stumbled through them was hard to miss. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in a suit that looked tailored in Milan or Paris. Yet the jacket was wrinkled, his tie loosened, and his steps uneven. His polished shoes clicked loudly against the marble floor as he walked in, swaying slightly from side to side. His face, handsome but flushed, revealed a state of heavy drinking. Amara immediately recognized him. Everyone in the hotel did. Mr. Richard Grant, the billionaire hotel mogul who owned the very chain they all worked for. His portrait hung in the lobby, smiling confidently in a crisp suit, the image of wealth and power. Guests whispered about him, staff admired and feared him, and managers barked orders twice as loudly whenever he was rumored to be visiting. To most, he was untouchable, a man whose signature could change lives or end careers. And now, here he was, disheveled, unsteady, clearly drunk. The few remaining staff froze where they were. Lucia, Amara's co-worker, shot her a wide-eyed look and mouthed, "Oh my God!" Another waiter quickly ducked into the kitchen, unwilling to be caught in the path of a drunken billionaire. But Amara stood still, watching him carefully. "Water," Mr. Grant muttered, his voice rough and heavy. He slumped into the nearest chair, the motion so abrupt that the table rattled under his weight. His hand reached for the wine menu, but it slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the ground. The silence in the room grew tense. No one moved. No one wanted to risk being the one to approach him in this state. What if he lashed out? What if he remembered the next day and demanded punishment for imagined slights? Amara felt the weight of their hesitation pressing against her chest. She could walk away like the others, but something inside her refused. Perhaps it was the memory of her mother, who had always taught her that kindness was never wasted. Perhaps it was the knowledge that drunk or sober, he was still a human being in need. Or maybe it was simply that she couldn't stand to see anyone suffer, even if that someone was a billionaire who would never notice her existence otherwise. She took a deep breath, smoothed her apron, and walked toward him. "Sir," she said softly, keeping her tone professional yet gentle. "Can I get you some water?" His bleary eyes lifted to meet hers. For a moment, it seemed like he didn't fully register her presence. Then he gave a slow nod, his lips parting as though the word had cost him great effort. Amara quickly filled a glass with chilled water and set it before him. "Here you are, sir," she said. There was a long pause. Then, with surprising trust, he rose unsteadily to his feet and leaned on her arm. He smelled faintly of whiskey and expensive cologne, the kind that lingered even when the man wearing it had lost control. Together, they began walking slowly toward the elevators. Each step felt heavy, not just because of his weight against her arm but because of the significance of the moment. Amara wasn't just a waitress now. She was the only person standing between a powerful billionaire and the humiliation of collapsing in his own hotel lobby. As they reached the elevator, Mr. Grant whispered, almost too softly to hear, No one ever stays. They just want something." Amara didn't reply. She simply pressed the button, guiding him gently into the elevator. She didn't want anything from him. Not money, not favor, not recognition. All she wanted was to make sure he got back safely. And though she didn't know it yet, that single act of compassion would soon ripple into a change so vast, it would alter the course of her entire life. The elevator ride seemed to last forever. The golden mirrors lining the walls reflected a strange pair. Amara in her simple black and white waitress uniform, and Mr. Richard Grant, the billionaire hotel owner, slumped against her arm like an exhausted child. His expensive silk tie dangled loosely, his shirt collar open, his usually commanding presence diminished by drink and fatigue. Amara kept her gaze fixed on the glowing floor numbers above the elevator door, silently praying they would reach his suite quickly. She had escorted intoxicated guests before, but never someone this important, someone whose name commanded both respect and fear among the staff. One mistake, one stumble, one misunderstood gesture, and she could lose her job. Still, she didn't let go of him. Her grip was steady, firm but respectful. When the elevator doors opened, she guided him carefully into the luxurious corridor of the top floor. The carpet was thick beneath her shoes, muffling their footsteps, and golden wall sconces cast a warm glow over the space. Each suite on this floor cost more for one night than Amara earned in a month. "Which room is yours, sir?" she asked gently. Mr. Grant fumbled with the inside pocket of his jacket, eventually producing a sleek keycard. It slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud. Amara bent quickly, retrieved it, and glanced at the number printed on the side. Penthouse 1201. She led him down the corridor, sliding the card into the slot. The lock clicked open, and the heavy door swung wide to reveal a space that took Amara's breath away. The penthouse suite was more like a mansion in the sky. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the glittering city below. Plush leather sofas, a gleaming marble bar, and a dining table that could seat 12 occupied the vast living area. A grand piano sat in the corner, untouched but polished to perfection. Amara had cleaned rooms like this once, years ago when she briefly worked as a maid. But she had never entered one as anything more than a shadow in the background. Now, guiding the billionaire inside, she felt strangely out of place, like an intruder in a world that wasn't hers. Mr. Grant stumbled toward the sofa but nearly lost his balance. Amara quickly steadied him, her small frame surprisingly strong as she lowered him gently onto the cushions. "Easy there, sir," she said softly. He let out a groan, pressing his hand against his forehead. "Everything's spinning." Amara moved quickly, scanning the room. She spotted a crystal water jug on the bar and poured a glass, returning to place it on the coffee table in front of him. "Here, drink this. It'll help." He reached for it clumsily, nearly tipping it over, but she steadied his hand. Their eyes met briefly, his clouded with fatigue and alcohol, hers calm and steady. "Why are you helping me?" he muttered. His voice was rough, almost suspicious, as though he wasn't used to kindness without a price attached. Amara hesitated. The truth was simple. "Because you need it." He studied her face for a moment, then let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Most people, they want something. Money, favor, power. You don't." "I don't," she agreed, straightening. "I just want to make sure you're safe. That's all." Silence fell between them, broken only by the ticking of the large designer clock on the wall. Amara felt the weight of the moment, the strange intimacy of standing in a billionaire's private suite while he sat vulnerable before her. But she didn't let it show. "Do you need me to call someone?" she asked after a while. "A friend? A driver, maybe?" He shook his head slowly. "No, no one." His eyes grew distant, almost hollow. For the first time, Amara wondered what kind of loneliness came with wealth like his, surrounded by people, yet never truly cared for. She adjusted a pillow behind him, ensuring he was comfortable. "Then you should rest. I'll leave some water here by your side." As she turned to go, his voice stopped her. "What's your name?" She hesitated at the doorway. "Amara, sir." He nodded, repeating it quietly, as though memorizing it. "Amara." Her hand rested briefly on the doorframe. She didn't know why, but hearing her name from his lips stirred something unexpected, like a faint spark of recognition in a man who otherwise seemed lost in shadows. With one last glance to be sure he was settled, she left the suite, closing the door softly behind her. The walk back to the service elevator felt surreal. She half expected someone to stop her, to question why she had been in the penthouse, but no one did. The hotel buzzed with the same life as always, guests laughing in the lobby, staff scurrying about their duties. For them, it was just another night. For Amara, it felt different. She had done something no one else dared. She had stepped forward when others stepped back. Not for reward, not for recognition, but simply because compassion demanded it. She didn't know that the man she had just left sleeping in the penthouse suite would remember her far more clearly than she imagined. And she didn't know that this single act, born out of kindness, would soon open doors that had always been closed to her. Tonight she was still a waitress, but fate had already begun to shift. The morning after she had guided Mr. Grant safely to his penthouse, Amara arrived for her next shift at the Crystal Heights Hotel with the same quiet determination as always. She tied her apron neatly, smoothed the creases from her uniform, and stepped into the buzzing staff lounge where waiters, cleaners, and receptionists gathered before dispersing to their stations. But the air felt different that day, charged, heavy with whispers. "Did you hear?" One of the younger waitresses, Tasha, murmured to her friend. Amara was seen going up to the penthouse last night. With him. Her friend gasped, eyes widening. "You mean Mr. Grant? The owner?" "Exactly." She helped him upstairs. Stayed in his suite for who knows how long. The two giggled, though the sound carried more malice than amusement. Amara, walking past with a tray of freshly polished cutlery, heard every word. She didn't flinch, didn't pause. She had grown used to whispers trailing her like shadows. In places like this, gossip spread faster than fire. Still, the sharpness of their tone pierced her heart more deeply than she let on. By the time she reached the restaurant, the rumors had already twisted into wilder shapes. "She's trying to impress him," said one busboy as he stacked dishes. "Please," a hostess scoffed, adjusting her lipstick. "Girls like her don't get noticed by men like that, unless they want something." "I heard she's aiming to get a promotion through him," another worker added knowingly. "You know how it is. Powerful men, pretty faces. She's not stupid." Everywhere she went, eyes followed Amara, some filled with curiosity, others with thinly veiled jealousy. Her act of kindness, one she hadn't even thought twice about, was being twisted into ambition, opportunism, even manipulation. Amara moved through it all with quiet grace. She smiled when customers arrived, served food with her usual efficiency, and didn't respond to the murmurs that buzzed just behind her. But inside, her chest felt tight. It wasn't fair. She hadn't asked for recognition. She hadn't asked for anyone's suspicion, either. She had only wanted to make sure Mr. Grant was safe, as she would have for any guest. But because of who he was, and because of who she was, the story had been warped into something scandalous. Later that afternoon, she found herself in the break room with Lucia, her closest friend among the staff. Lucia, who had always been blunt, didn't waste time. "Amara," she said, setting down her coffee cup. "What exactly happened last night?" Amara sighed, leaning against the counter. "Nothing. He was drunk. I helped him to his suite, made sure he had water, and left. That's it." Lucia studied her closely, her dark eyes searching for any sign of hesitation. But Amara's steady gaze never faltered. "I believe you," Lucia said finally. "But you know how people are. They'll spin it into whatever story they want." Amara nodded. "Let them. I know the truth." Still, it stung. She had worked tirelessly to maintain her dignity in a world where waitresses were often overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated. Now, because of one simple act of compassion, her reputation was being questioned. By evening, the gossip had reached even the supervisors. Mr. Keene, the restaurant manager, called her into his office. His tone was stern but tinged with curiosity. "Amara," he began, folding his hands on the desk. "I've heard some talk about you and Mr. Grant. Care to explain?" Amara kept her voice calm, though her heart pounded. "He was intoxicated, sir. I didn't think it safe for him to walk alone. I escorted him to his suite, gave him some water, and left. That's all. Mr. Keene raised an eyebrow. You understand how it looks, don't you? Staff members in the penthouse. It raises questions. With respect, sir, Amara replied, standing straighter. If I had ignored him and something had happened, people would still be talking, but about negligence instead. I did my job. I cared for a guest. There was silence. Mr. Keene studied her a moment longer before sighing. Very well. Just be careful. Not everyone here will see it the way you do. When she left the office, Amara felt both weary and strangely proud. She had spoken her truth without trembling, without apology. She had nothing to hide. That night, as she wiped down another table, she overheard two waiters whispering nearby. Do you think he'll remember her? One asked. Doubt it. The other scoffed. Men like him don't notice waitresses. She's wasting her time if she thinks otherwise. Amara bit the inside of her cheek, forcing herself to focus on her work. She wasn't waiting for recognition. She wasn't waiting for favors. She had only done what was right. But even as she told herself that, a quiet thought flickered in her mind. What if he did remember? A week passed before Mr. Richard Grant returned to the Crystal Heights Hotel. This time, he wasn't stumbling through the lobby with whiskey on his breath or collapsing into a chair in the restaurant. No, this time he arrived in the manner everyone was accustomed to seeing him. Tall, polished, and commanding. His sleek black car rolled up to the front entrance, and the staff hurried to attention as if the president himself had arrived. The concierge stood straighter. The bellboys practically tripped over each other to grab luggage, and the managers plastered smiles on their faces, eager to impress. But beneath the surface of his composed exterior, Richard carried a memory that had been gnawing at him all week. It wasn't the taste of fine wine from that night or the dizzy blur of conversations he barely remembered. It wasn't even the embarrassment of drinking too much at his own property. No, the image that stayed with him was of a young woman with steady hands and kind eyes, guiding him into the elevator when everyone else had turned away. He remembered the way she had spoken to him, calm, without fear or flattery. She hadn't fawned over him like most people did. She hadn't recoiled either, as others might have. She had treated him like a human being, not a billionaire, not a hotel tycoon, not a man who owned more properties than he could count. Just a man who needed help. That, Richard realized, was rare. In his world, people smiled too much, agreed too quickly, and took too eagerly. They wanted contracts signed, checks written, deals closed. Very few, if any, offered him genuine kindness with no strings attached. Yet this woman, what was her name again? Amara. Yes, that was it. Amara. She had spoken it softly when he asked, just before she left him to rest. He had repeated it to himself the next morning, rolling it around in his mind like a secret he wasn't ready to let go of. Now, as he walked through the lobby surrounded by employees desperate to please him, his sharp gaze was searching for her. Sir, would you like us to prepare the conference hall for your meeting? The manager asked eagerly. Later, Richard replied curtly, brushing past him. His thoughts were elsewhere. He entered the restaurant where he had last seen her. The tables were neatly set for the lunch rush, and the waitstaff moved briskly about. His arrival caused a ripple. People whispering, standing taller, moving faster. But Richard wasn't watching them. He was scanning the room for one familiar face. And then he saw her. Amara was by the window, adjusting cutlery on a table, her movements precise and careful. The sunlight streamed in, catching on the edges of her braids. She didn't notice him at first. She was focused on her task, the way she always was. But when she finally lifted her head and their eyes met, something flickered across her face. Surprise, then composure. She dipped her head politely and turned back to her work. Richard felt something stir in his chest. Most people, upon catching his gaze, would rush forward, eager to seize his attention. But she did not. She treated him as though he were any other guest. And that only intrigued him more. Who is that? Richard asked the manager beside him, nodding subtly toward her. The manager blinked. Her? That's Amara Johnson. One of our waitresses. She's been here about 3 years. Quiet girl. Hard worker. Keeps to herself. Richard's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. 3 years. A quiet girl. Hard worker. Yes, that matched the impression she had given him. I'd like to speak with her, he said simply. The manager looked startled. With her, sir? If you wish, I can. No, Richard cut in firmly. I'll speak with her directly. He crossed the room, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. Amara straightened immediately, unsure of what to expect. For a heartbeat, she considered slipping into the kitchen to avoid the stares now burning into her back from the other staff. But she stood her ground. Mr. Grant, she greeted softly when he reached her table. Her voice was respectful, but not obsequious. Amara, he said, testing the name again, this time aloud. It rolled easily off his tongue. She blinked, surprised he remembered. Yes, sir. There was a pause. The entire restaurant seemed to still, everyone waiting for his next words. I remember what you did for me last week, Richard said finally. His tone was quieter than usual, stripped of its commanding edge. You helped me when you didn't have to, when no one else would. Amara shifted uncomfortably under his steady gaze. I was just doing my job, sir. No, he corrected firmly. You went beyond your job. Most would have walked away. You didn't. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Thank you, he added, almost softly. Her heart thudded in her chest. She had never imagined this billionaire, would thank her for anything. She gave a small nod. You're welcome, sir. Richard studied her for a moment longer, then leaned slightly closer. Tell me, Amara, what do you want for yourself? Beyond this job. Her lips parted in surprise. No one had ever asked her that. Not her managers, not the guests she served, not even most of her friends. To them, she was simply the waitress. Nothing more. She hesitated, unsure how to answer. But something in his expression, curious, patient, told her he truly wanted to know. And in that instant, Amara realized her life might be on the verge of change. The restaurant buzzed faintly with the midday crowd, but for Amara, the sound faded into the background. She stood frozen for a moment, still processing Mr. Grant's question. What do you want for yourself? No guest had ever asked her that before. No manager either. For most people, her existence began and ended with her uniform. The neat black apron, the tray balanced in her hand, the polite smile that never quite reached her tired eyes. To them, she was a role, not a person. Yet here was Richard Grant, the billionaire owner of the hotel, looking at her as though she were someone worth listening to. Amara's instinct was to deflect, to brush off the question with something safe. But there was something in his gaze, steady, patient, and unexpectedly sincere, that disarmed her usual caution. Sir, she began carefully, I don't think my dreams would interest someone like you. Try me, Richard said, lowering his voice so only she could hear. For a moment she hesitated, then finally let out a breath. I want stability, not just for me, for my brother. He's still in school. I've been taking care of him since my mother passed. Her voice wavered slightly, but she steadied it. I work these long shifts to keep us afloat. Sometimes it feels like that's all life is. Working, surviving, trying not to fall behind. Richard's eyes didn't waver. And beyond surviving? What would you do if survival wasn't your daily battle? That question caught her off guard. She looked down at the polished table she had just set, her fingers tracing the edge absent-mindedly. I suppose I'd want to build something of my own. Maybe a small cafe. A place where people could come and feel welcome. Nothing fancy, just honest, warm. She smiled faintly, almost embarrassed. It sounds silly, doesn't it? To her surprise, Richard shook his head. Not at all. It sounds real and rare. Before Amara could reply, the restaurant manager cleared his throat nervously from across the room, clearly uneasy with the sight of his powerful employer speaking so intently with a waitress. But Richard ignored him completely. "Walk with me," he said suddenly, turning back to Amara. Her heart skipped. "Sir, on your break. Come," he insisted gently but firmly. "I want to hear more." She glanced toward the manager, who looked like he was about to protest. But one sharp look from Richard silenced him instantly. Amara untied her apron slowly, feeling the curious stares of her coworkers as she followed Richard out of the restaurant. They walked through the lobby, past gleaming marble floors and chandeliers, and into one of the smaller lounges that overlooked the city. The space was quiet, sun pouring in through tall glass windows. Richard gestured for her to sit, and for the first time, Amara found herself seated across from the man who owned not only the hotel but a vast empire of luxury properties. "You intrigue me, Amara," he said plainly. "Most people in my orbit, they want something. A deal, a contract, an introduction. But you helped me when I was at my worst, and you asked for nothing. Why?" Amara met his gaze steadily. "Because it was the right thing to do. I don't think kindness needs a reason." For a moment, Richard was silent. He studied her as though trying to reconcile the simplicity of her words with the complexity of the world he knew. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You remind me of someone," he admitted quietly. "My mother. She used to say the same thing, that kindness is its own reward." His expression softened, a glimpse of vulnerability breaking through his usual steel composure. "It's been a long time since I met someone who lived by that." Amara didn't know what to say. She felt the weight of the moment but also the strangeness of it. How easily their conversation had shifted from formal to personal, as though two very different worlds were overlapping. "I'm not special, Mr. Grant," she said finally. "I just try to do what my mother taught me. Work hard. Be kind. Stand tall, even when life feels heavy." Richard tilted his head, studying her again. "You say you're not special, but you are. Do you realize how rare it is to find someone who doesn't see me as a walking bank account?" She gave a small, almost amused smile. "To me, you're just a man who drank too much whiskey." Richard laughed. An unexpected, genuine laugh that startled even him. It was the first time in days that he had felt something lighten in his chest. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was thoughtful, filled with unspoken possibilities. Amara sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, composed but inwardly cautious. She didn't know what this conversation meant or where it might lead, but she sensed, with a strange certainty, that it wasn't ordinary. Richard leaned forward slightly. "Amara, what if I told you, survival doesn't have to be the end of your story?" Her brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out the tall windows at the skyline, his expression unreadable. But in his silence, Amara felt the air shift. Something was happening, something bigger than her, bigger than this moment. She couldn't name it yet, but she felt it in her bones. Her life, which had long been a cycle of endless shifts and quiet resilience, was about to change. The next few days passed in a blur for Amara. She returned to her routine of long shifts, carrying trays, offering polite smiles, and managing exhaustion with quiet determination. Yet something within her had shifted since her unexpected conversation with Richard Grant. His words lingered in her mind like a haunting melody. "Survival doesn't have to be the end of your story." She didn't quite understand what he had meant, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just brushed against something extraordinary. Still, she told herself not to expect anything. Men like him lived in a different world, and whatever curiosity had drawn him to speak to her would fade as quickly as it came. By the end of the week, Amara's body was sore, her feet aching from double shifts. The hotel restaurant was hosting a private event that evening, a gathering of executives, investors, and partners. For the staff, it meant perfection was mandatory. Every glass had to sparkle, every table had to be exact, and every server had to move like clockwork. Amara tied her apron and slipped into the rhythm of service, balancing trays of champagne flutes with practiced grace. She barely registered the glittering gowns, the sharp suits, the sound of laughter echoing against the marble. For her, this was another long night, another duty. But midway through the evening, The atmosphere shifted. The music softened. The crowd stilled as Richard Grant himself stepped onto the small platform at the center of the ballroom. Dressed in a tailored black suit, he looked every inch the powerful billionaire the papers described him to be. Conversations hushed. All eyes turned to him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his deep voice carrying easily through the room, "thank you for being here tonight. This hotel has always been more than a business to me. It's been a symbol of excellence, of hospitality, of dreams made real. But tonight I want to speak about something else. Something more personal." Amara, standing near the edge of the room with a tray in hand, felt her breath catch. She hadn't expected him to address the crowd himself. Usually, his executives handled these affairs. Her eyes flickered toward him, then quickly away. Richard continued, his gaze sweeping across the audience but pausing, almost imperceptibly, when it landed on her. "A week ago, I was reminded of something I'd nearly forgotten. That kindness and integrity still exist in this world, even in the quietest corners. Someone reminded me of that." Amara's heart pounded. She wanted to tell him to stop, that this attention was too much, but his words kept flowing. "I've made many decisions in my life," Richard said, his voice steady. "But tonight, I want to make one of the most important. I've decided to step back from this hotel, and I cannot think of anyone more deserving, more capable of carrying forward its legacy, than Amara." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Amara's world tilted. The words didn't make sense. He couldn't mean. Richard turned to her, his eyes warm. "Amara, I want you to take ownership of this hotel." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Investors shifted uncomfortably, some outraged, others astonished. Cameras flashed, but Amara could only stare at him. Her lips parted in disbelief. "Me?" she whispered hoarsely. "Yes," Richard said simply, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You." Her legs threatened to give way. Ownership of this hotel? It was impossible. She was a waitress, struggling to pay rent, to put food on the table for her brother. She couldn't even dream this big. Richard leaned closer, his voice softer now, meant only for her. "You said you wanted to build a place of your own. Here it is. Not because of pity, but because I believe in you. And I think you'll honor this place in a way few ever could." Tears welled in Amara's eyes. Her throat burned as she fought to speak. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Richard said with a smile. And in that moment, surrounded by glittering lights and a sea of stunned faces, Amara realized her life had changed forever. The ballroom still buzzed with shock long after Richard's announcement. Guests whispered furiously to one another, unable to comprehend what they had just heard. Wait staff stood frozen, their trays wobbling in disbelief. And at the center of it all stood Amara, her hands trembling, her heart hammering, her entire world turned upside down. Ownership of the hotel? The thought seemed absurd. Only a week ago, she had been scrubbing coffee stains from tablecloths and counting tips in the dark to make sure her brother could eat. She was nobody in the eyes of this glittering world. And yet, Richard's words hung in the air like an undeniable truth. She tried to protest, to find her voice, but Richard squeezed her hand lightly and whispered, "Trust yourself, Amara. This is your moment." That night, after the event, the board members and executives cornered Richard with heated arguments. They cited contracts, finances, reputations. But Richard remained firm. "I've already made arrangements," he told them coolly. "This hotel will belong to Amara. If you have concerns, direct them to me. But understand this, my decision is final." Amara, overwhelmed, slipped away quietly after her shift ended. She walked home through the quiet city streets, her uniform wrinkled, her mind spinning. The neon lights blurred in her vision as tears filled her eyes. Could it be true? Could she really step into such a world? She thought of her mother, who had worked her fingers raw to keep food on the table. She thought of her little brother, asleep at home, who still looked at her with hope despite their hardships. Maybe, just maybe, this was the answer to all the prayers she had whispered late at night. The following week was nothing short of surreal. Amara found herself summoned to meetings she had never imagined attending. Lawyers and advisors explained contracts, shares, and ownership structures. At first, the language was overwhelming. A maze of legal and financial terms she barely understood. But Richard made sure she was never alone. He sat with her during every discussion, patiently breaking down each step. "You don't need to be perfect right away," he told her, noticing her panic. "What you need is vision, and you already have that. The rest you'll learn." Slowly, Amara began to believe him. She remembered the countless nights she had dreamed of building a place of warmth and welcome, a place where people weren't just served but seen. Maybe this hotel could be that place. Her first visit as the official owner was nothing short of breathtaking. She walked through the gilded lobby in a modest dress, her steps uncertain at first. Guests and staff alike stared, whispering. Some didn't believe it. Others, like her fellow waiters and cleaners, looked at her with a strange mix of awe and pride. They knew what it meant for one of their own to rise so high. The manager, red-faced and stiff, reluctantly addressed her with Ms. Amara. The title felt strange, almost unreal, but she held her head high and returned his gaze calmly. For the first time, she wasn't the one being ordered around. She was the one setting the standard. Of course, the journey wasn't easy. Challenges came swiftly. Some investors questioned her abilities. Some staff resisted the change, doubting a former waitress could lead them. Mistakes happened. Missed calls, paperwork errors, moments of self-doubt that left her in tears behind closed doors. But Amara refused to give up. She leaned into the qualities that had carried her through every hardship: humility, hard work, and resilience. She treated the staff not as subordinates but as partners. She listened to their concerns, learned their names, and remembered their struggles. She knew what it felt like to be invisible, and she vowed no one under her watch would feel that way again. Slowly, the atmosphere began to shift. Staff who once doubted her started to rally around her. Guests noticed the difference. An extra warmth, a genuine touch of hospitality that no amount of luxury could buy. The hotel wasn't just a building of marble and chandeliers anymore. Under Amara's guidance, it became a place with a soul. One evening, months later, Amara stood in the very lobby where she had once carried trays with shaking arms. Now, she wore a sleek suit, her hair neatly styled, her posture confident. A guest approached her, complimenting the hospitality and the sense of care they felt. Amara smiled, thanking them warmly, but inside she was overwhelmed. This is real, she thought. This is mine. Her brother, now attending a good school, often teased her. "So, when do I get to stay in the presidential suite?" he joked one night, eyes shining with pride. Amara laughed, pulling him close. "One day," she promised. "But remember, this is ours. Everything we went through brought us here." Richard visited often, not as a controlling hand, but as a mentor and friend. Sometimes they'd share coffee in the lounge, discussing business strategies or dreams for the future. Other times, they'd sit in comfortable silence, both knowing they had changed each other's lives in ways deeper than money or titles could measure. Standing in her office late one evening, Amara looked out the tall glass windows at the city skyline. The lights glittered like stars, and for the first time in her life, she felt she truly belonged among them. Her journey had begun in the shadows, exhausted, overlooked, dismissed. But she had never stopped believing, never stopped pushing, never stopped giving. And now, she stood not as a servant of the world, but as a shaper of it. A new beginning had arrived, not just for her, but for everyone who would walk through the doors of her hotel. She had taken her place, not through luck, but through kindness, resilience, and the courage to embrace the impossible. And deep in her heart, she knew this was only the beginning of a far greater story.